Hi everyone, we wanted to just share a little bit about our new summer series coming up called John's Story. We're going to jump into the Gospel of John, and for you to have the best encounter and experience with it, we wanted to just give a bit of a backdrop to this wonderful account that John tells of Jesus' life, death and resurrection. I read a scholar who describes the Gospel genre as such in this way. It's an introduction to Jesus' life that builds to the main event, which is the Passion. I love that description of it. And Matthew, Mark, Luke and John all display those characteristics. The Gospels were written to protect the integrity of the eyewitness accounts of Jesus' life and his teaching and what would become the Jesus tradition. You see, up until that point, it had been an oral tradition, as these stories would have been incredibly familiar with Christians and being told regularly amongst the churches as they gathered. But because it was such an illiterate culture, oral tradition was seen as the most reliable way to be sharing these stories of who Jesus was. But as these eyewitnesses started to come towards the end of their lives, it was felt important to get this down in writing to protect the integrity of these stories. John's account was the last of the four Gospels that made it into the canon of Scripture to be written in about 90 AD. That's some 50 odd years after Jesus died, and to give you further perspective, it's probably 30 years after the Apostle Paul died as well. This story is very much looking back into the accounts of Jesus and the experiences of the church. What we find with the first three Gospels, Matthew, Mark and Luke, known collectively as the Synoptic Gospels, is a consistency. There's lots of familiarity and lots of common writing that appears in all of them, but John's Gospel is a little bit different to them. It's far more elongated, it's far more poetic, it's far more descriptive. And there are some other clear differences. For example, it's focused on Jesus in Jerusalem, whereas we find the Synoptics, although they venture into Jerusalem for the Passion, their main focus is around the Galilee region. There are no parables found in John's Gospel, but they are in the Synoptics. There were 3 Passover occurrences in John's Gospel, yet 1 in the Synoptic Gospels. John's teaching seems to be far more orientated towards the disciples rather than the crowds as it is in the Synoptics. There's different stories as well, unique stories that we find in John's Gospel, like Lazarus in John 11 and the water into wine right near the beginning of John's account. Those aren't ones that appear in the Synoptics. And we also find a different order sometimes too. So the turning of the tables that we will also explore in this series comes right at the beginning of John's account, whereas in the Synoptics it appears near the end. One of the things, as I mentioned earlier, that you find in John's Gospel is these beautiful, winding introductions into these stories. It isn't just the punchy story headline you find. You find these discourses that lead us in and lead us out of these miracles and these key encounters of Jesus' life. And that's exactly what we're going to be jumping into in this series. Some of the surrounding bits to these well-known stories. One commentator described them as almost being parabolic in nature, the way John tells these stories. Now, it's okay that John's retelling is different. That shouldn't freak us out. Is one accurate and the other's inaccurate? Is one true and the other's untrue? John took the tradition of the Gospels and told it in a way that he felt comfortable with as he looked back through his life and through these encounters that he'd experienced with Jesus himself and through the emerging history of the church. It's almost like there were certain things that he wanted to highlight more than others. And don't forget that his writing of these Gospels came after the others, so he would have been familiar likely with the other Gospels. John chooses to mould it in a way where he feels really comfortable, sticking to this tradition, but in his own distinct way, he tells these stories differently to the Synoptics. So as we go through this series, I want to encourage you to remember a couple of key things. Firstly, this isn't John's diary, day-by-day account. This is John looking back 50 years from Jesus' death into Jesus' life, his story of what happened. Secondly, let's remember this is a key moment as the stories of Jesus go from the oral tradition to a written tradition, a big leap within that society and the context. And finally, John was definitely weaving in some layers and deep, rich meanings as he told these stories, which we will jump into through this series. We will dive into the treasure found in these discourses around the 6 stories that we've chosen. I hope that helps you understand a bit of the backdrop of John's Gospel a little bit more, so you can get even more treasure out of this series as we work through it over the next 6 weeks.